In an era of blood and dust, when the word savage was a death sentence and the line between enemy and neighbor was as thin as a razor's edge, one woman's choice would echo across the unforgiving plains of the Arizona Territory. This isn't just a story of the Old West. It's the true account of a secret pact, a forbidden love, and a reckoning that brought a frontier to its knees. What would you risk for a stranger? Your home, your family, your life. Prepare yourself for the story of Sarah Jenkins and the Apache warrior who changed her world forever. The sun in the Arizona Territory was a merciless god. It beat down on the parched earth, baking the clay into a cracked mosaic and bleaching the very life from the landscape. For Sarah Jenkins, the daughter of a stern preacher-turned-farmer, Jedediah Jenkins, this unforgiving land was the only home she had ever known. Their homestead, a modest timber and adobe structure, clung to the edge of Whisper Rock Canyon, a place of breathtaking beauty and profound, unsettling silence. Sarah was not like the other girls in the small, dusty settlement of Providence a day's ride away. While they practiced their needlepoint and gossiped about the cavalrymen stationed at Fort Grant, Sarah found solace in the vast, wild emptiness that surrounded her. She had her father's sharp intellect, but her late mother's compassionate heart, a combination that often set her at odds with the harsh realities of frontier life. Her father, a man whose faith was as hard and unyielding as the land he tilled, saw the Apache, or the Nde, as they called themselves, not as people, but as a scourge, a test of his piety to be endured, and if necessary, eradicated. It was on a blistering afternoon in late August of 1878 that Sarah's world tilted on its axis. She had taken one of her customary long walks, venturing farther than usual into the labyrinthine network of smaller ravines that branched off the main canyon. The air was thick with the scent of hot dust and creosote bush. A hawk circled high overhead, its lonely cry amplifying the profound solitude. It was in this quiet that she heard it a sound that did not belong. A low groan, like the grinding of stone on stone muffled by the heat. Fear, cold and immediate, prickled her skin. It could be a cougar, or worse, a prospector who'd met his end at the fangs of a rattlesnake. But her curiosity, a trait her father often despaired of, was stronger than her fear. She followed the sound, her worn leather boots making soft scuffs in the red dirt. Behind a cluster of jagged, sun-scorched boulders, she found him. He was an Apache warrior. The intricate patterns painted on his chest and face, though smeared with sweat and dirt, were unmistakable. He was young, perhaps no older than 20, with high cheekbones and a cascade of long black hair that fell across his shoulders. But it was the wound that seized her attention, a dark, ugly stain spread across the buckskin of his left thigh, and the ground beneath it was soaked in blood. A cavalry bullet, she guessed from the look of it. His eyes, black and fierce as a starless night, were slitted with pain, but they tracked her every move with a burning intensity. He was cornered, wounded, but far from broken. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. Every instinct, every warning her father had ever drilled into her, screamed at her to run. This was the enemy, a savage, a heathen. The men from Fort Grant, under the command of the ambitious Captain Wallace, were on a relentless campaign to pacify the territory, and this warrior was their quarry. Helping him was not just foolish, it was treason. She could be shunned, her family ruined, or worse. The soldiers wouldn't be kind to an Apache sympathizer. She took a half step back, her mind a whirlwind of conflict. She thought of the stories she'd heard in Providence of brutal raids of families slaughtered. But then she looked into his eyes again. She saw not a monster, but a man who was bleeding to death under the relentless sun. She saw desperation, defiance, and a flicker of something else, pride. In that moment, he was not an Apache, not an enemy. He was a human being, suffering. Her mother's voice, a gentle echo from a time before the harshness of the frontier, had silenced her, whispered in her memory. "Compassion, Sarah," she used to say, "is the one language all souls understand." The decision came upon her, not like a thunderclap, but like the quiet, inexorable turning of the tide. She couldn't leave him. She wouldn't. Her movements were slow, deliberate, so as not to spook him further. She unslung the canteen from her shoulder, her hands trembling slightly. She held it out to him, an offering. His eyes narrowed with suspicion. He watched her, his hand hovering near the knife, still sheathed at his hip. He was a coiled spring of pain and distrust. "Water," she said, her voice a dry rasp. She repeated the word, pointing to the canteen, and then to her own lips. For a long moment, he did nothing. The only sounds were the buzz of a fly and the ragged rhythm of his breathing. Then, with a slow, agonizing effort, he reached out and took the canteen. His fingers brushed against hers, and a jolt as potent as a lightning strike passed between them. He drank long and deep, the water spilling down his chin and onto his chest. He handed it back, his gaze never leaving her face. Sarah knew this was just the beginning. Water wouldn't stop the bleeding. It wouldn't hide him from the soldiers who were surely scouring the canyons for him. She looked back the way she came, towards the distant silhouette of her family's homestead. She had to get him there. She had to hide him. It was a mad, reckless, and dangerous idea, and she knew with a certainty that both terrified and thrilled her that she was going to do it. Getting the wounded warrior back to the homestead was a Herculean task that tested every ounce of Sarah's strength and resolve. He couldn't walk, and she couldn't carry him. She ended up half dragging, half supporting him, his arms slung over her shoulders, his weight a heavy, searing burden. His name, he managed to rasp out, in a voice raw with pain, was Taza. It meant giant in his tongue, a bitter irony given his current state. Every rustle of a lizard in the underbrush, every shadow that danced on the canyon walls sent a fresh wave of panic through her. She imagined the glint of a cavalry saber, the shout of a soldier, the catastrophic end of her secret before it had even truly begun. But the canyons remained silent, their stony indifference a cloak for her desperate act. She led him not to the main house, but to the old, disused root cellar, its entrance concealed by a thicket of overgrown mesquite bushes behind the barn. It was damp, smelling of earth and forgotten things, but it was safe, or as safe as any place could be. Inside the cool darkness, Sarah's medical knowledge, gleaned from her mother's old herb books and the harsh necessities of frontier life, was put to the ultimate test. The bullet was still lodged deep in his thigh. Leaving it in meant infection, a slow, agonizing death. Taking it out was a risk that made her stomach churn. With Taza drifting in and out of consciousness, she sterilized her father's sharpest skinning knife in the flame of a lantern. She bit her lip, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs, and she began to cut. Taza's body arched in a silent scream of agony, his hands clenching into fists, but he did not make a sound. It was a display of willpower that left Sarah breathless. Finally, with a sickening squelch, she pried the mangled piece of lead from his flesh. She cleaned the wound with whiskey from a hidden flask she kept for medicinal purposes, and packed it with a poultice of yarrow and comfrey leaves, just as her mother had taught her. She bandaged it with strips of her own petticoat, the fine linen a stark contrast to his blood and dirt-caked buckskin. For the next 3 days, Sarah lived a life of duplicity. By day, she was the dutiful daughter performing her chores with a feigned serenity, her ears constantly strained for the sound of approaching hoofbeats. By night, she was a clandestine nurse slipping out to the cellar with stolen food-fresh water and more bandages. Her father, Jedediah, was a man of rigid habits, and this was her saving grace. He rarely ventured near the barn after dark. Her younger brother Samuel, a boy of 12, was her biggest risk. He was inquisitive and idolized the cavalrymen often playing soldiers and savages near the very spot where she had hidden Tarza. Sarah had to constantly divert his attention, a task that frayed her nerves to the breaking point. The tension in the homestead was palpable. A cavalry patrol led by a young, ambitious lieutenant named Alistair Finch had stopped by the Jenkins homestead the day after she found Tarza. Finch was a recent West Point graduate, eager to make a name for himself. He was polite, even charming, with a clean-shaven jaw and eyes the color of a summer sky. He had taken a clear interest in Sarah, and under normal circumstances, she might have been flattered. Now his presence was a source of pure terror. "We're hunting a small band of Chiricahua renegades, ma'am," he had explained, his gaze lingering on Sarah. "They attacked a supply wagon near the San Pedro River. We wounded one of them, but he slipped away into the canyons. A real devil by all accounts. If you see anything at all, you send word to the fort immediately." Sarah had nodded, her face a mask of polite concern. Her hands clenched so tightly in the folds of her apron that her knuckles were white. "Of course, Lieutenant. We'll be sure to keep our eyes peeled." The lie felt like acid on her tongue. Down in the cellar, a strange and silent bond was forming between Sarah and Tarza. The language barrier was a formidable wall, but they found ways to communicate. He would teach her Apache words, his voice a low rumble in the darkness. She would point to objects, water, bread, blanket, and he would repeat the Nde names. He taught her that the hawk was Iji, the sun Shah. She learned that his people did not see the land as something to be owned, but as a living, breathing entity, the source of all life. She saw the intricate tattoos on his arms not as savage markings, but as a story written on his skin. He touched the small silver cross she wore around her neck, a gift from her mother, with a look of genuine curiosity, not disdain. In the shared silence, in the flickering lantern light, they were not a white woman and an Apache warrior. They were just Sarah and Tarza. One evening, as she was changing his dressing, he reached out and gently touched a stray lock of her honey-blonde hair. It was a simple, innocent gesture, but it sent a shock wave through her. No one had ever looked at her with such raw, unvarnished intensity. It was a look that saw past her plain dress and her father's rigid doctrines. It was a look that saw her, but their fragile sanctuary was about to be shattered. On the 4th night, as a storm brewed on the horizon, bringing with it the distant rumble of thunder, Samuel came running into the house, his face pale with excitement and fear. "Father Sarah riders are coming," he yelled. "It's Lieutenant Finch, and he has a tracker with him." An Apache scout. Sarah's blood ran cold. An Apache scout. He would know where to look. He would see the signs she had missed: a broken twig, a scuffed rock. He would be led inexorably to the old root cellar. Their secret was over. and her life, she knew with a sickening certainty, was about to be forfeit. The news hit Sarah like a physical blow. An Apache scout. Her carefully constructed deception was about to crumble. Panic, sharp and suffocating, seized her. She looked at her father, whose face had hardened into a mask of grim determination as he reached for the rifle he kept mounted above the fireplace. Samuel, caught between fear and boyish excitement, peered out the window. "They're heading for the barn." Samuel reported his voice a high-pitched whisper. Sarah's mind raced. The scout would find the signs of her passage. The disturbed earth, the faint trail she'd left dragging Taza. The cellar. He would find the cellar. She had only minutes, maybe seconds. "Father," she said, her voice surprisingly calm, betraying none of the terror that was rioting inside her. "I need to secure the chickens. The storm will frighten them." Jedediah. His attention, focused on the approaching soldiers, gave a curt nod. "Be quick about it, girl." It was the opening she needed. She didn't run. She walked with a measured pace that felt like wading through molasses out the back door and towards the barn. The wind was picking up, whipping her skirts around her legs and carrying the scent of rain. The sky was a bruised purple, and the first fat drops of water began to fall. She reached the mesquite thicket, her heart hammering a frantic tattoo against her ribs. She pulled open the heavy cellar door. "Taza," she hissed into the darkness. "You have to go. Now soldiers are here. With a scout." He was already moving. He had heard the riders. He had fashioned a crude crutch from a piece of old timber and was standing his face a grim mask of pain and resolve. The wound in his thigh was still raw, but the fever in his eyes had receded, replaced by the cool, calculating gaze of a warrior. "The storm," he said, his voice a low rasp. It was one of the few English words he had mastered. "It will hide my tracks." "Where will you go?" she asked, her voice choked with a sudden, overwhelming sense of loss. He pointed to the east, towards the distant, jagged peaks of the Dragoon Mountains, a known Apache stronghold. It was a long, perilous journey for a man in his condition. There was no time for goodbyes. The sound of voices was getting closer. She could hear Lieutenant Finch's crisp, authoritative tones. She had to get Taza out before they started their search. There was a back exit to the cellar, a narrow, half-collapsed tunnel that her grandfather had dug as an escape route during the early, more violent years of settlement. It opened up into a dry creek bed, 100 yards from the homestead. She led him through the musty darkness of the tunnel, the air thick with the smell of damp earth. When they reached the exit, a sliver of bruised twilight in the distance, he stopped. The rain was coming down in earnest now, a driving torrential downpour that turned the world into a blur of grey. He turned to face her. In the dim light, his eyes, dark and intense, held hers. He reached into the small leather pouch at his waist and pulled out a single, perfectly formed hawk feather. Its tip dyed a deep crimson. He pressed it into her hand. "For Iji," he whispered, using the Apache word for hawk, the one she had seen circling the day she found him. "You have the heart of a hawk. You fly against the wind." Her fingers closed around the feather, its softness a stark contrast to the calloused roughness of his hand. It was a promise, a memento, a brand on her soul. She urged, her voice breaking. "Be safe." He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, and then he was gone, melting into the driving rain and the deepening twilight like a phantom, his limping gait swallowed by the storm. Sarah stumbled back through the tunnel, her mind a numb void. She closed the cellar entrance just as Lieutenant Finch, accompanied by a grim-faced Apache scout in a cavalry jacket, rounded the corner of the barn. "Miss Jenkins Finch," said his voice sharp with authority. "We're conducting a thorough search of the area. My scout, a man by the name of Cheto, believes our fugitive may have passed this way." Cheto's eyes, small and black, as beads of obsidian, swept over the area. They lingered for a fraction of a second on the mesquite thicket, and Sarah's heart stopped. But the rain, their unexpected savior, was relentless. It was washing away everything, every track, every scent, every trace of the secret she had kept. With all due respect, Lieutenant Sarah said, finding a strength she didn't know she possessed, "The only thing you'll find here are my chickens, and they're not partial to strangers." Finch looked from her to the downpour, a frown creasing his brow. The search was becoming impossible. "Very well," he said, his voice tight with frustration. "But we'll be back. This renegade won't get far." She watched them retreat, their figures dissolving into the grey curtain of the storm. She stood there for a long time, the rain plastering her hair to her face and soaking her dress, the hawk feather clutched so tightly in her hand that it felt like a part of her. Taza was gone. She had saved him. But as the cold reality of her actions settled upon her, she realized that a part of her had gone with him out into the wild, unforgiving heart of the storm, and she knew, with a chilling certainty, that nothing would ever be the same again. The weeks that followed Taza's escape bled into a long, unquiet autumn. The storm had washed away his tracks, and with them any immediate threat of discovery. But it had not washed away the secret that now lived inside Sarah, a living, breathing thing that colored her days with anxiety and her nights with restless dreams. Life on the homestead returned to its familiar, monotonous rhythm. Jedediah preached his fire and brimstone sermons to his small congregation in Providence every Sunday, his voice full of righteous certainty. Samuel practiced his aim with a slingshot, his boyish games of war, a constant, unnerving reminder of the real conflict that simmered just beyond the horizon. But for Sarah, the world had changed. The silence of the canyons no longer felt like solitude, it felt like emptiness. She kept the hawk feather Taza had given her hidden in a small carved wooden box that had belonged to her mother. At night, she would take it out, its softness a tangible link to the man who had briefly and irrevocably upended her world. She would trace its delicate structure with her finger and whisper the few Apache words he had taught her, prayers sent out into the vast, uncaring darkness. Lieutenant Alistair Finch became a regular visitor to the Jenkins homestead. He would ride out from Fort Grant under the pretext of checking on their safety, but his intentions were clear. He was courting Sarah in the formal, stilted way of the time. He would bring her small gifts, a book of poetry, a ribbon for her hair, and engage her father in long, serious conversations about politics and the Apache problem. Jedediah approved of the match. Finch was a man of good standing, a representative of the order and civilization he so desperately sought to impose upon the wilderness. "He is a good man, Sarah," he would say, his gaze stern. "A respectable man. You would do well to encourage his attentions." Sarah was polite to the lieutenant. She would sit with him on the porch, her hands busy with her mending, and listen to his stories of life back east, of a world of gas lamps and paved streets that felt as foreign to her as the moon. He was handsome, intelligent, and kind in his own way. He represented a future that was safe, predictable, and approved of by her society. A future that should have been everything she wanted. But her heart was a traitor. When Finch looked at her, his sky-blue eyes full of sincere admiration, she felt a profound sense of dislocation. He saw a proper young lady, a future wife for a cavalry officer. He did not see the woman who had cut a bullet out of a man's leg with a skinning knife, the woman who had lied to the US Army, the woman who kept a hawk feather hidden like a sacred relic. Her conversations with Finch were a constant source of tension. He spoke of the Apache as a monolith, a faceless, savage enemy. "We will hunt them down, Miss Jenkins," he said one afternoon, his voice ringing with conviction. "We will pacify this land and make it safe for decent folk. It is our manifest destiny." Sarah's hand tightened on the mending in her lap. "Are they all the same, Lieutenant?" she asked, her voice quiet but firm. "Are there no differences between them? No good, no bad?" Finch gave a patronizing smile. "My dear Miss Jenkins, your compassionate nature is a credit to you. But you do not understand the true nature of the savage. They are like wolves. They cannot be reasoned with, only tamed or eliminated." The words were like a slap. She wanted to scream at him, to tell him about the man who had endured her clumsy surgery without a sound, the man whose eyes held not savagery, but a deep, soulful intelligence. But she held her tongue, the secret a burning coal in her throat. News from the outside world trickled in, carried by travelers and supply wagons. The Apache wars were escalating. Cochise was dead, but other leaders Victorio Geronimo had taken his place. There were stories of raids, of skirmishes, of violence on both sides. Every time she heard a new report, a cold knot of fear would tighten in her stomach. Was Taza safe? Was he a part of these raids? The thought that he might be that the man she had saved might now be a part of the violence that so terrified her community was a bitter pill to swallow. One evening a prospector, his face pale with shock, stumbled into Providence with a story of a Chiricahua war party that had ambushed a stagecoach. He spoke of a tall, fierce warrior, one who fought with the fury of a demon. He mentioned a flash of crimson at the warrior's temple, a detail that made Sarah's blood run cold. A hawk feather, its tip dyed red. That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. She sat by her window, the wooden box open in her lap, and stared out at the moon-drenched canyons. Was it him? Had her act of compassion simply unleashed another killer upon the world? Or was he fighting for his home, for his people, for his very survival in the only way he knew how? The conflict raged within her, a silent, secret war that was every bit as brutal as the one being waged across the territory. She was torn between two worlds, belonging to neither. The world of Alistair Finch, with its promise of safety and conformity, and the world of Taza, a world of danger, passion, and a connection so profound it defied all logic. As the first hint of dawn painted the eastern sky in shades of rose and grey, Sarah looked at her reflection in the window pane. The face that stared back at her was that of a stranger, a woman haunted by a choice defined by a secret and waiting, though she didn't know for what, for the unquiet peace of her life to finally be broken. The winter of 1878 gave way to a tense spring. The land, rejuvenated by the winter rains, burst forth in a riot of color. But the beauty of the landscape did little to soothe the simmering fear that gripped the settlements. The name of the Apache leader Geronimo was on everyone's lips, a whisper of terror in the wind. Lieutenant Finch and his men were constantly on patrol, their blue uniforms a stark, moving line against the greening hills. Sarah had settled into a kind of weary resignation. She maintained her polite, detached relationship with Finch, a dance of propriety that satisfied her father, but left her feeling hollow and dishonest. The hawk feather remained in its box, a secret sacrament in her fractured life. The memory of Taza had begun to feel less like a sharp, immediate pain, and more like a dull, persistent ache, a ghost that walked beside her in the quiet moments of her day. Then on a clear, bright morning in May, the world stopped. It began with a flicker of movement on the high ridge to the east, a place where nothing ever moved but the wind and the hawks. Samuel saw it first. He had been perched on the fence, carving a piece of wood with his pocket-knife. "Father," he shouted, his voice cracking with a mixture of awe and terror. "Look!" Sarah and Jedediah rushed out of the house. Sarah's hand flew to her mouth, a gasp catching in her throat. The ridge was no longer empty. It was lined with them. Dozens of them. Apache warriors, sitting motionless on their ponies, their figures silhouetted against the brilliant blue sky. They were like bronze statues, a silent, intimidating army that had materialized from the very earth. They were too far away to make out individual features, but the sheer number of them was enough to stop the heart. This was not a small, desperate raiding party. This was a tribe. Inside, Jedediah commanded his voice, a low, urgent growl. He shoved Samuel towards the house and grabbed Era's arm. "Get the rifle, Sarah. Bar the door." Panic erupted. Jedediah bolted the heavy wooden door and slammed the shutters on the windows, plunging the main room into a gloomy twilight. He took his position at a loophole he had carved into the adobe wall, his rifle ready. Samuel, his face ashen, huddled in a corner, clutching his knife. Sarah's mind was a chaotic storm. This was it. The reckoning she had both dreaded and in a secret, dark part of her heart longed for. Was Taza among them? Had he come back for revenge? Had he told them about the white woman who had helped him? Was her act of mercy about to bring about the destruction of her entire family? The minutes stretched into an eternity. The silence from outside was more terrifying than any war cry. They were just sitting there on the ridge watching. It was a war of nerves, a psychological assault, and it was working. Then they began to move, not in a wild, chaotic charge, but in a slow, deliberate procession, down from the ridge and across the open ground towards the homestead. They flowed like a river of men and horses, their movements fluid and coordinated. Sarah, her hands trembling, peered through a crack in the shutters. At the head of the procession rode a single warrior. He was taller than the others, his posture radiating an authority that was unmistakable. He wore a simple buckskin shirt, but a magnificent headdress of eagle feathers adorned his head, and at his temple, catching the morning sun, like a drop of blood, was a single hawk feather. Its tip dyed crimson. It was Taza. He was no longer the wounded, desperate fugitive she had hidden in her cellar. He was a leader. He rode with the pride and confidence of a king returning to his kingdom. The man who followed him carried a long staff adorned with feathers and beads, a sign of peace. They were not here for war. They stopped 100 yards from the house. The silence descended again, thick and heavy. Then Taza did something that stunned Sarah to her core. He dismounted, handed the reins of his pony to another warrior, and began to walk towards the house. Alone, unarmed. "Hold your fire, father," Sarah cried, her voice ringing with a desperate authority she didn't know she possessed. She moved to stand in front of him, shielding the loophole with her own body. "Get out of the way, girl!" Jedediah snarled, his eyes wild with a mixture of fear and rage. "He's a devil. It's a trick. No, Sarah insisted, her gaze locked on the approaching figure of Taza. "He's come to talk. Can't you see, he's unarmed?" Taza stopped about 20 paces from the door. He stood there, his dark eyes fixed on the house, his face impassive. He simply waited. Suddenly the sound of hoofbeats came from the other direction, fast and urgent. A cloud of dust announced the arrival of Lieutenant Finch and a dozen of his men. They had seen the Apaches from a distance and had come at a full gallop. They reined in their horses, forming a line between the homestead and Taza, their rifles drawn and ready. The scene was a tableau of imminent violence, the lone Apache warrior, the terrified family barricaded in their home, and the U.S. cavalry, ready to unleash a volley of hot lead. "What is the meaning of this?" Finch demanded, his voice tight with controlled fury. His pistol aimed squarely at Taza's chest. "You are trespassing on private land. You and your warriors will disperse immediately, or we will open fire." Taza did not even glance at Finch. His gaze was still fixed on the house on the shutter, where he knew Sarah was watching. And then, to the astonishment of everyone, he spoke, not in his native tongue, but in clear, heavily accented but understandable English. "I have not come to see you, soldier," Taza said, his voice calm and resonant, carrying easily in the tense silence. "I have not come for war. I have come for her. I have come for the woman with the heart of a hawk." Taza's words fell into the charged silence like stones into a still pond, sending ripples of shock and disbelief through everyone present. Inside the dim homestead, Jedediah's face went slack. His righteous fury momentarily replaced by stunned confusion. Samuel's eyes were wide, darting from the shuttered window to his sister's face. Sarah felt as though the floor had dropped out from beneath her. He had come for her. The secret she had carried for so long was no longer a secret. It was laid bare for all to see under the harsh light of the Arizona sun. Lieutenant Finch was the first to recover. A dark flush crept up his neck, his handsome face contorting with a mixture of jealousy and outrage. "What nonsense is this?" He spat his pistol unwavering. "This is a renegade, a murderer. He's playing some kind of sick game." Before anyone could react, the heavy bar on the homestead door scraped back, and the door swung open. Sarah stood framed in the doorway, her face pale, but her eyes blazing with a fierce resolve. She had to end this before blood was shed. "He is not playing a game, Lieutenant," she said, her voice clear and steady, carrying a weight that made even Finch pause. She took a step out onto the porch, her simple calico dress a stark contrast to the military blues and the buckskin of the warriors. Taza's eyes met hers, and in their dark depths she saw a universe of emotion, gratitude, respect, and a profound, unwavering affection that made her breath catch in her throat. He took a step forward, ignoring the cavalryman completely. He stopped at the edge of the porch, his gaze never leaving her. "I have not forgotten," he said, his voice softer now, intended for her alone. "In my time of weakness, you showed me strength. In my darkness, you were a light. My people have a law. A life saved owes a debt. My life is yours." He then turned his gaze to Jedediah, who had appeared in the doorway behind Sarah, his face a thunderous mask of disbelief. Taza stood tall, his presence exuding a quiet dignity that was more powerful than any weapon. "I am Taza, son of Cochise, brother to Naiche. I am a chief of the Chiricahua. I have not come to take. I have come to offer. I have brought horses, many fine horses, as a bride price." He gestured back to his warriors, and several of them led forward a string of magnificent ponies, their coats shimmering in the sun. "I ask for the hand of your daughter Sarah. I wish to make her my wife, to honor her in my lodge, and protect her with my life." The proposal was so audacious, so completely outside the realm of possibility, that for a moment no one knew how to react. A chief son of the legendary Cochise, asking to marry a preacher's daughter. It was madness. Jedediah was the first to find his voice. A strangled, guttural sound of pure outrage escaped his lips. "Marry you!" he roared, his face turning a blotchy red. "A heathen, a savage, you dare to stand on my land and speak such blasphemy. My daughter will never marry one of your kind. I would see her dead first." "Father, please," Sarah begged, turning to him, her eyes pleading. "This is an insult," Finch declared, his voice ringing with self-righteous anger. He saw his own hopes of courting Sarah evaporating before his eyes. "An insult to this family and to all decent folk. This is a tactic, a way to sow discord. Men, be ready." His troopers raised their rifles, the clicks of the hammers echoing in the tense air. The Apache warriors who had remained silent and still responded in kind. Bows were raised, arrows were nocked. The peaceful morning was now balanced on a knife's edge, ready to explode into a bloodbath. Taza held up a hand, a simple calming gesture that immediately stilled his warriors. He looked not at the soldiers, but at Sarah, his expression one of patient understanding. He knew this would be the reaction. He had prepared for it. "This is not a trick," Taza said, his voice cutting through the tension. He looked directly at Sarah, his gaze bypassing the angry men who stood between them. "This is a matter of the heart. It is a matter of honor. The choice does not belong to your father or to this soldier. The choice belongs to you." He was right. In that moment, surrounded by the anger of her father, the jealousy of Finch, and the threat of imminent violence, Sarah felt a strange sense of clarity. For her entire life, her path had been dictated by others, by her father's faith, by society's expectations. Now she was being offered a choice, a terrifying, world-altering choice. She looked at her father, his face contorted with a lifetime of prejudice. She looked at Finch, who saw her as a prize to be won, a symbol of the civilization he was fighting to build. And then she looked at Taza. He saw her, the woman who had saved him, the woman with the heart of a hawk. The cultural chasm between them was as wide and deep as the Grand Canyon. His world was one of traditions she couldn't comprehend, of hardships she could barely imagine. Her world saw him as the enemy, a creature to be feared and destroyed. To choose him would be to abandon everything she had ever known. She would be an outcast, a traitor to her own people. Her family would disown her. She would be utterly alone, save for him. And yet, the thought of returning to her old life of marrying Finch and living out her days in quiet conformity felt like a prison sentence. It would be a betrayal of the truest, bravest part of herself, the part that had chosen compassion over fear in that sun-scorched ravine. "You have 1 minute to leave," Finch warned, his voice shaking with barely suppressed rage. 1 minute, or we will turn this ground red with your blood." The sun beat down. A horse snorted. The world held its breath, waiting for her answer. Sarah knew that her next words would not just decide her own fate. They would decide who lived and who did on this beautiful, terrible morning. The world had narrowed to the space between the porch and the lone Apache chief. The 60 seconds of Lieutenant Finch's ultimatum ticked away, each one a hammer blow against the fragile silence. Sarah felt the full weight of the moment press down on her, a physical force that threatened to crush her. This was not just a choice between two men. It was a choice between two lives, two worlds, two futures. And the chasm between them was terrifyingly vast. Her past, present, and potential futures collided within her in a dizzying, painful kaleidoscope. She saw a life with Alistair Finch with stark clarity, a respectable life in a neat, whitewashed house at the fort. She could almost smell the lye soap and lemon polish. Her days would be filled with polite conversation, managing the household, attending Sunday services, where her father would preach, and receiving the quiet approval of the other officers' wives. It would be safe. It would be secure. It would be predictable. And it would be a lie. A slow suffocation of the soul. She would spend the rest of her days hiding the most vital part of herself, the woman who had defied everything to save a life, the woman who kept a hawk feather in a box like a holy relic, a secret goddess in a pantheon of one. Then she tried to see a life with Taza. The vision was far harder to conjure, a whirlwind of fragmented images filled with unknown landscapes, unfamiliar customs, and the constant shadow of hardship and danger. She saw herself in a wickiup, the Apache dwelling of branches and hides, the air thick with the smell of wood smoke and roasting meat. She saw herself as an outsider, a white woman in a Chiricahua camp, her blonde hair a stark beacon among the dark-haired people. She would have to learn a new language, a tongue that felt like stone and wind on her lips. She would have to learn new traditions, a new way of being that was tied to the earth and the sky. It would be a life of profound uncertainty, of loneliness, of being forever other. But it would be real. It would be a life lived with a man who had seen her soul, not just her face. It would be a life where her compassionate heart was not a liability to be tamed, but a strength to be honored. 30 seconds. Finch's voice was strained, his authority crumbling in the face of this unprecedented situation. One of his troopers, a young man with fear-widened eyes, shifted his rifle nervously, the barrel wavering. "Sarah, for the love of God, come inside her father," pleaded his voice, cracking. For the first time, she heard not just anger in his tone, but raw, desperate fear. Fear of losing her to a world he equated with damnation. She looked at her father, his face a tortured mask of love and prejudice, and her heart ached with a grief so profound it was a physical pain. "I cannot, Father," she said, softly, her voice filled with a sad finality. The woman who would come back inside that door is not your daughter. Not anymore. To do so would be to deny the only part of me that truly feels like my own. She then turned to Lieutenant Finch, her gaze direct and unflinching. "And I will not marry you, Lieutenant. I am grateful for your attentions, but my heart is not yours to command, and my life is not a territory to be conquered." Finally, she turned her full attention to Taza. He had not moved, his patience a testament to his confidence in her. His eyes held hers, a silent conversation, passing between them that no one else could understand. It spoke of canyons and water, of pain and healing of a hawk feather, and a debt of honor that transcended all boundaries. With a deep breath that felt like her first and her last, she made her choice. She stepped off the porch. Her boots sank into the soft dust of the yard. The simple act felt momentous, a crossing of a line from which there was no return. Each step was a deliberate, irrevocable act. A step away from her family, her home, her people. A step towards the unknown. Sarah. No. Jedediah cried out a sound of pure, soul-deep anguish. He took a stumbling step forward as if to follow her, but seemed rooted to the spot by the sheer impossibility of what he was witnessing. Finch's face was a mask of disbelief. "What are you doing? This is madness. You're signing your own death warrant. They'll kill you before the moon is high." But Sarah didn't stop. She didn't look back. She walked across the open ground. Her gaze locked with Tarza's. The cavalrymen watched their rifles half lowered in confusion, their military certainty shattered. The Apache warriors watched their stoic expressions, unreadable, but a low murmur rippled through their ranks. She walked through the invisible line that divided their two worlds, and the world did not end. The sun did not fall from the sky. She stopped directly in front of Tarza. She had to crane her neck to look up at him, at the proud lines of his face, the intensity in his dark eyes. The world around them seemed to fade away. There were no soldiers, no grieving father, only the two of them suspended in a moment of impossible truth. She reached into the pocket of her dress, her fingers closing around the familiar shape of the small, crimson-tipped hawk feather. She held it out to him on the palm of her hand, an offering and an answer. A slow smile, the first she had ever truly seen, spread across his face. It transformed his features, softening the warrior's grimness and revealing a warmth and tenderness that stole her breath. He did not take the feather. Instead, he gently took her hand, his calloused fingers enclosing hers, and the feather between them, a gesture of profound intimacy and acceptance. "The heart of the hawk has come home," he said, his voice a low, reverent murmur. He turned, still holding her hand, a simple act of possession and protection. He faced the stunned soldiers and her heart-broken father. "There will be no war today," he announced, his voice ringing with the authority of a chief. "The bride price has been accepted. The union is made." He led her towards his pony. He swung himself up into the saddle with a fluid, practiced ease, and then reached down for her. She took his strong hand, and he pulled her up to sit in front of him, her back resting against the solid wall of his chest. It felt both strange and utterly terrifyingly right. As they turned to leave, Sarah allowed herself one last look back. The image would be burned into her memory forever. She saw her father, who had finally collapsed onto the porch steps, his face buried in his hands, his broad shoulders shaking with silent sobs. A broken man. She saw Samuel, his young face, a battlefield of confusion, betrayal, and a dawning, horrified understanding that his sister was truly gone. And she saw Lieutenant Finch, standing frozen, his pistol hanging limply at his side, the very picture of a world whose rigid rules and manifest destinies had just been shattered by a single woman's choice. Her heart broke for them, for the pain she was causing, for the life she was leaving behind. A tear traced a path through the dust on her cheek, a salty tribute to all she was losing. But she did not waver. Tarza gently urged his pony forward, and the river of warriors fell in behind them, their procession slow and stately. They rode east, away from the homestead, away from the settlement of Providence, towards the jagged purple peaks of the Dragoon Mountains, towards a new life. Sarah did not know what the future held. She did not know if she would ever see her family again. She knew there would be hardship, loneliness, and moments of profound doubt that would test her to her very core. But as she felt the steady, reassuring beat of Tarza's heart against her back and the warmth of the Arizona sun on her face, she also felt a sense of peace she had never known. She had listened to the compass of her own conscience. She had followed the call of her own soul. She had flown against the wind. And for the first swoop in her life, she was truly breathtakingly free. Sarah's story wasn't just a legend whispered around frontier campfires. It was a testament to the untamable power of the human heart to bridge even the most divided of worlds. Her choice to leave her life behind for a future with Taza was an act of rebellion, an act of faith, and an act of profound love that defied an entire era of hatred and prejudice. Theirs is a story that reminds us that beneath the labels of savage and settler, enemy and friend, lies a shared humanity. If this journey into the heart of the Old West moved you, please give this video a thumbs up and share it with someone who loves a true story of courage and conviction. Don't forget to subscribe and ring that notification bell so you don't miss our next chapter from the forgotten pages of history. Thank you for watching.